Welcome step closer to the line where maps go quiet, where antlers catch the moon, where two marching roads stop without orders. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Tell me what you felt in these first seconds, the hush, the cold in the lungs, the pause that shouldn't be there, and keep that feeling with you as we cross into the Old North. February 1869. Pine valleys sealed under a sky thinned to metal. The river forks ahead, black water with a lace of ice adrift that isn't steam sliding off the right bank like a shawl. Boots in the west, boots in the east. Two columns threading toward the same narrow mouth, each certain the night will surrender if pressed, but the night presses back. Do you hear it? The dry whisper snow makes when a heel touches crust. How that whisper carries farther than it should, bounces between trunks, returns as a reminder you are measured here. Someone in the west mutters a prayer he hasn't used in years. Someone in the east tightens a strap and pretends his fingers aren't shaking. Overhead, the pines huddle like a vaulted ceiling, bars of moonlight. Bars of shadow bars, counting men who thought they were beyond counting. The place does not forgive straight lines. At the tree line, a figure stands half-turned human in balance, crowned with tines that hold a rim of gold as thin as breath. He doesn't lunge, doesn't threaten. He simply is. And everything that was moving slows to the speed of a thought. You expect the shot that isn't fired, the shout that doesn't come. Instead, powder at ankle height lifts in a small swirl and lays itself down like a careful hand smoothing a page. A sergeant on the west road opens his mouth, closes it. An adjutant on the east traces the timber edge and pretends his pencil didn't hesitate. The watch set like a hinge in the dark turns the night without a touch. Look left. The mist carving down river leaves a clean panel, a margin where the impossible writes itself. A village file, 12 souls, moves, without fanfare, elder child, a lean runner at point. Each foot placed inside the last print metronome steps. They move when the needles tremble, stop when the needles fall still. Keep their faces turned from the bright bars where the moon paints a chest like a target. The runner kneels palm on crust, reading with skin more than sight, then nods toward the fork where fog gathers. No one argues. The line inclines into the shawl, into a corridor the armies cannot see. Behind them, certainty grinds. Scouts taste the arithmetic of cold sound carrying sidewise. Visibility collapsing to 2 body lengths, bright lanes that make a man feel struck before he's seen. They retreat not from fear, from math. The figure at the edge of the trees offers something smaller than a command and larger than a suggestion. A half-turn antlers catching, losing, catching again the thin ribbon of light. It's enough. A West Road corporal who bragged once that he feared nothing behaves suddenly, as if the woods remember him. An East Road lieutenant, tidy with pens and plans, pockets the confidence that was supposed to lift his men through everything. He bargains with the dark. We wait, we shift, we take the bridge 2 miles south. This is a different kind of advance, the kind measured in refusals. Silence becomes action. Fog becomes doctrine. Negative space becomes ally. If you came for spectacle, you'll find a stricter wonder, a boundary insisting on itself. We'll call him Deer Man, because the mouth wants a name, because light needs something to cling to when it makes a point, because antlers framed by needles persuade the eye to slow down and the will to measure its reach. If a man saw only a deer, he might fire. Only a man, he might order forward. Seeing both, he does neither. The half-turn holds him, holds both roads long enough for the village to vanish. Hush, did you catch it? The single cough folded into wool, then nothing. The runner's palm presses the crust again and decides with pressure rather than words. Elders glide their weight like smoke. The child counts wind between heartbeat and heartbeat. Drift shakes loose from a bow, drifts back into the cups of their footprints, erases them as they make them. A self-healing page. 5 minutes later, a stranger would call this place Untouched, and he wouldn't be wrong. On the West Road, an officer raises a glass. Know not to drink to mark angles, and the lens fogs. He wipes names it weather names, it prudence. Leadership is what waiting calls itself when it needs dignity. In the East, a captain tells a joke that lands without sound. Men don't laugh at margins drawn by cold. The woods don't recognize rank, they recognize weight, breath, heat, intention. Misplace those, and you become visible. Carry them correctly, and you cease to exist. The watcher teaches without speaking an etiquette, enforced without hands. Remember the first principle of this night. You cannot outshout a place that outlistens you. The moon writes with a hard, thin pen. Snow files away what doesn't belong on top of the ledger. The river's exhalations are couriers bearing a white seal pass quietly, or do not pass at all. Villagers know this in the body breathing, with wind stepping inside prints, keeping the face a fraction turned. Armies know it as discomfort, then hesitancy, then decision. Nothing mystical, only the physics of winter and the humility it demands. You wanted the shock, here it is. Not terror, not spectacle insistence. The map bows to the place. The columns slow for a figure that never speaks. The forest keeps itself unbroken. Lean closer, you won't find the seam of the trail they used. Listen harder, you'll hear boots choosing the bridge they didn't plan to need. Feel, if you allow it, the relief of a child whose cough no longer has to hide. And hold that breath with me a moment longer. Because this is how the night begins, slowly at first. Then, all at once, when the path you thought you owned turns and disappears. Late winter settles like a slow, deliberate hand over the Old North. A pressure you feel in the lungs before you see it in the sky. A quiet that isn't peace so much as a rule observed. The calendar says February 1869, though the forest seems older than months, older than years, older than the ink that names them. Dawn comes narrow and late. Dusk arrives early and certain. Noon shivers on the bark and then slips away. The pines stand close, trunk to trunk, stitching the air into a high green vault that traps breath and sound. Snow sits crusted where the wind combed it glassy on slopes, feathered in hollows, ready to betray weight with a crisp report that travels farther than the mouth intends. And down in the fold where two waters meet, one colder, one warmer, the river forks draft their own weather. A faint gleam of black where ice thins. A film of white where fog keeps its appointment with the banks. A shawl that drapes and lifts and drapes again. Maps simplify all of this to a clean junction, a gentle bend, a marked bridge 2 miles south. The ground refuses to be so civilized. To the west, Forza moves. Files are tidy, spacing measured 18 inches between men in column 4, paces between companies, discipline audible in the way leather answers, gravel in the way iron agrees with wood. They travel a road that remembers wheels, a strip cut through timber years ago so that wagons might insist on straight lines. The men are older than their boots suggest hard miles have that effect. Yet the march has not made them humble. They believe in schedules, in orders, in the arithmetic of supply that turns miles into meals and powder, and the strange confidence that comes from knowing someone has counted for you. Their officers note the hour as if it were an ally. Their scouts look to the tree line and see shadow drafted into narrow lanes. Their quartermaster glances at the clouds and mutters about a hard freeze by nightfall. The column is heavy with intention, and intention out here has a sound. To the east, another road carries another file. Different flag, same hunger, same math. They know the fork as a place to be claimed, two approaches converging like tongs, a pinch point where strategy can be made visible for the record. The men are not cruel by design. They are persistent by profession. They have marched through towns that did not ask for their passage and across fields that did not forgive it. Timber is simply the next medium to master. Their adjutant reads the map with care and traces the dark band that signifies forest dense, then underlines it, then closes his book with a decisive tap. He likes decisive taps. He believes a firm sound turns doubt into policy. Between these columns, the forest makes its own column unwritten, whose height cannot be measured by ranks. Snow records what the air tells it. Air records what the needles tell it. Needles record what the moon tells them to reflect. The mechanics are old, impartial, exacting. Cold air pools at the surface and bends sound toward the ground. A whisper becomes a wire. A footfall becomes a statement. The canopy lets moonlight through in bars, bright and dark, so that a man walking perpendicular to the grain will pass through a sequence of exposures that make his chest feel counted, named, offered. Fog pulls along the water. It thickens at the meeting of tributary and main stem, and where it thickens, the world shrinks to 2, 3 body lengths. Eyes strain, ears overcorrect. The brain deprived of distance invents it where it can, and yet the place offers help to those who ask correctly. Lower trails below the crest along the shadowed ribs of the valley carry less sound outward. Crevices hold the wind like an instrument holds breath. Pauses exist small, regular, predictable when the branches release their burden and the falling powder reseals cups of footprints as neatly as a clerk smoothing a page. A runner raised here can hear those intervals, can count them without numbers, and can usher a line through the canvassed, dark like ink, passing under a straight edge. The villagers call them Force B, if you need a military word. Though the word doesn't fit, do not think in frontage and flanks. They think in the old phrasing of bodies, and breath, put your foot where I put mine. Look where the light is least, breathe when the needles shake, stop when they hold. Elders have taught these rules around stoves whose iron glows cherry at the lips of the draft. Children have practiced them when snow turned the hills into lessons. There is nothing mystical about this only memory tuned to climate until it sounds like instinct. They know the road invites attention. They know the bend invites artillery. They know that open snow shouts and timber whispers, and that the whisper is a language that needs time. Time, however, is what the columns seek to deny. Both are racing an idea. The idea that presence equals possession, that if you can place a man, a flag, a ledge of iron on a coordinate before dawn, the place becomes a fact you can file. Their commanders are not fools. They are merely obedient to a ledger that demands entries. But ledgers, like rivers, prefer neat lines, and Winter's pen has its own hand. The officers confer, glance at the moon, at the lay of the fog, at their men's faces. Faces shaved or stubbled tell truth that reports will later make polite. The truth is that sound has lengthened, steps have shortened, breaths have learned to stay inside the scarf. A quick crossing becomes a careful approach, becomes a consultation, becomes a decision deferred. In this long, careful hour, the watch earns its capital letter. Call it Dear Man if you like, because the mind likes shapes to hold the unseen rule. The figure appears at the margin, where bright and dark argue antlers catching a thin gold seam as the moon moves, body held in that human poise that suggests decision without shouting it. To one road, he is a mark in the eye that won't be rubbed away. To the other, he's the reason a hand that meant to wave men forward becomes a hand that signals wait. He is not a messenger. He is not a judge. He is posture, the posture of the boundary itself. Soldiers will not write him, elders will. Both will obey. Context, properly told, admits the stomach along with the sky. The men in the west taste iron at the back of the throat, fatigue turning metallic as it dries the mouth. The men in the east feel a break in their shoulders where the day's weight has sat too long. Boots leak its seams, socks stiffen, fingers turn clever or stupid depending on whether the body remembers what warmth is. When a sergeant says, "Hold," the word enters muscle before it reaches mind. When a lieutenant says, "We wait for moon to clear that scud," the men nod because the scud gives them permission to want what they already wanted. Not to be the first into bars of light that stripe a clearing like a set of rules. There are facts under all this feeling, cold facts that documentary voice should name, even as it keeps the camera on breath and frost. In timber of this density, 50, 60, 70 stems per acre night movement for loaded men can drop to 2 miles per hour or less. Lateral hearing increases because of temperature gradients. Line of sight shrinks, turns tactical doctrine into an exercise in trust. Bridges become magnets because they promise geometry, edges, planks, a center line to own. But bridges away from forks have a cost measured not only in distance, but in sequence. One column moving south forces the other to choose between rivalry and redundancy, and in that, choosing momentum bleeds. Meanwhile, a file that knows the left bank fog like a friend can pass under the nose of both, so long as it offers nothing the moon can seize. The villager's file does exactly that. An elder's shawl lies matte against the night. A child's breath is cupped by fabric. The runner at point feels crust through his palm as if reading Braille written by weather. He senses, if we must pick a technical phrase, the microgust that precedes a sift from branches that moment when the air predicts its own movement. He waits 2 beats, 3, and steps. Behind him, 12 bodies compress into one line, the width of a hand, and the forest accepts this narrowness as if forgiving their presence in exchange for their discipline. They turn where the dark runs deepest to the fork, where water throws a veil over eyes. Stride length shortens. The pause between steps grows. Distance becomes a series of careful negations, not that ridge, not that lane, not that hour. Across the valley, reports begin to phrase themselves. Timber passage unlikely under current visibility. Scouts advise caution pending increase in light. Recommend shift to bridge per contingency. No one writes fear. Fear offends the page. But the men know what the page means. They know the etiquette of winter has more authority tonight than rank. They have learned some the hard way, that snow won't bargain with a plan, that fog won't translate an order into sight, that a bar of light can feel like a crosshair whether or not anyone holds the rifle. Officers shoulder this knowledge and make it look like leadership. That is their art. They will be promoted for it quietly later. The promotion will not mention antlers. The forest witnesses these decisions without favor. Pines shift and return. A fox navigates the edge of scent and disappears into a crease of shadow where even its own body seems unsure it was ever there. Ice ticks soft, regular. The river keeping time so men can pretend they invented schedules. Somewhere above the canopy, clouds debate whether to thicken and end the argument. For now, they hold off, perhaps amused, perhaps merely tired. The place is not a character, but it behaves like one because people do. They grant it intention when it intercepts theirs. They grant it voice when it outlistens them. They grant it mercy when it permits passage to those who ask well. This is not romance. It is accountability to medium. Force A west tilts toward prudence. Force A east does the same. When 2 contrary lines arrive at the same conclusion, men call it consensus to save face, or providence to save pride or weather, to save the language of command from confessing its limits. It doesn't matter what name they pick. The outcome is stillness at the timber's lip. A measured shift south. The sound of iron and wood exhaling as a plan revises itself. The fork of the river accepts this with the patience of water, which has watched men invent reasons for centuries. It cares only for the angle at which fog renews itself, for the tiny eddies whose white breath turns lanes to curtains. It will do this again tomorrow and the day after until spring changes the script. And above it all, there where bright meets dark and bars of moon trade, places something holds the night to its better self. Not a sentinel with a speech, not a terror with teeth. A posture, a hinge, a narrow authority that asks for no oath and keeps none but the one the forest swore to itself before men arrived with ledgers. Context is this: a landscape that insists on its physics. Two columns that must acknowledge them. A village that has memorized them so thoroughly that memory becomes motion. A figure at the margin who gathers stray light and returns it as instruction. The story does not require miracles. It requires respect. And respect on nights like this travels farther than orders, cuts cleaner than road, and leaves fewer scars than victory won the loud way. Fact lives in the cold, not in slogans, not in banners here in February light that thins to pewter and makes a ledger of every breath. Let's ground the night slowly, exactly, without romance. Start with temperature, late winter, Old North holding at -6 to -10 Celsius, before midnight dropping a few more degrees in the hours before dawn. The lower the air, the faster it thickens close to the surface. Sound bends downward, refraction by temperature gradient, so a boot on crust becomes a broadcast, not a whisper. A heel's crisp report travels laterally through trunks, ricochets off large stems, returns with just enough delay to make a man feel watched. The forest is not a stage. It is an amplifier. A file that believes it can move quietly by will alone discovers physics will grade that belief loudly if weight and rhythm are wrong. Weight, then. A soldier in winter carries 30 to 40 kilograms coat, blanket, roll, cartridge box, canteen, haversack, sometimes a share of a toolkit or ration load, plus the rifle or musket, plus boots that stiffen when sweat freezes. Add snow adhesion at the welt. Add a thin veneer of ice on laces by second watch. Stride shortens, heel-to-toe angle flattens. Knees lock more often than doctrine recommends. The road where it exists carries this weight. The timber refuses, distributes it back into ankles and hips, and the body responds by thumping more than stepping. Thumping grows the footprint of sound. A margin of 2 paces between men in column will not dissolve that physics. It only spaces the percussion. When a sergeant hisses easy, easy, the trees grade him too. Surface. There is nothing uniform about snow. Up on the shoulder of the valley, wind-scoured crust holds for an adult for 2, maybe 3 steps, then collapses unpredictably. In the hollow, drifted powder swallows the foot, hisses when pulled free, and leaves a cup with edges so clean it will preserve a line sequence for half a night, unless wind writes its edit. Between those bands sits the mixed zone glaze over sugar treacherous, for the ankle exemplary for sound. The glaze snaps. The sugar squeaks. The squeak repeats. The echo returns. Under a thin moon, the glaze also paints the calf with a dull shine. A man becomes a lantern to himself. This is why lore in the villages instructs stay low on the darker side. Travel where the fog will smudge you. Keep to the ribs below the crest, so the bars of moonlight bright. Dark. Bright do not count you 1 bar at a time. Visibility measurable, not mystical. In mature pine with birch and cedar understory, at densities near 50 to 70 stems per acre night. Sightlines compressed to 15, 20, sometimes 30 paces under quarter moon. With thin overcast they shorten further, and even the notion of a lane deceives. What looks like a hallway opens into a tangle that refuses symmetric motion. Lanterns increase the sense of control while destroying it. Backscatter on frost makes a bubble of light that blinds the bearer beyond a few yards and announces itself to anyone who knows how to read the rhythm of brightness on trunks. Eyes at night need sequence more than distance markers at shoulder height. Silvered needles, the faint seam where fog thickens above warmer water. So when a commander orders, "Take me 20 paces in," Keep your eyes, he is asking men to abandon the few instruments that work and trade them for a metric that doesn't. Time. Everything here is tempo. Journal entries from winter posts write it without poetry. Average night rate in forest below 2 miles per hour. In mixed crust, rates fall to 1 1.25. Files pause each 50 paces to let breath and sound settle. Patrols turn back when they cannot guarantee flank contact after 2 such pauses. The river forks add their own metronome, a right-hand tributary, shallower, quicker exhales, a thin veil. The main stem deeper, slower holds colder air. Where they meet, the veil renews on a cycle that a boy raised near the banks can feel in skin nudged by barely warmer drafts. Stand at the right distance and you vanish every 90 seconds, as if a curtain drew itself 20 seconds later. You reappear as if revealed by theater. But this is not theater. It is boundary management written in dew point and flow rate. Erase and write, erase and write. Wind brushed from boughs falls as sift. Not a storm, a periodic punctuation. A line that keeps exact intervals with those soft drops will leave evidence that self heals by dawn. Cups of footprints fill edges, blur the page, returns to blank. A line that breaks the rhythm, stumbles, rushes, hesitates in glare, forces the snow to memorize its mistake. Scouts with good boots and good nerves can read those mistakes and turn them into pursuit. Scouts with average boots and hungry nerves will overread and invent ghosts. The villagers rely on the first truth and the second weakness in equal measure. They lay a trail small enough to be misread, slow enough to be erased, exact enough to forgive the elder who must set his heel inside the last print, even when his knee argues. Doctrine cold and clean. Armies prefer geometry. They want perpendiculars, road to timber, timber to river, bridge to bank. Geometry multiplies command files, align fronts, present fires, intersect. None of that thrives under a canopy turning the world into vertical pillars and horizontal bars. To break the forest into obedient shapes requires noise axes on saplings, engineers at work effort. A column hesitates to spend at night under watch, under cold. Doctrine has a drawer labeled weight. A cautious officer reaches into it when intelligence cannot confirm what lies 10 paces in. He writes phrases like impracticable under present conditions, visibility inadequate for ordered advance pioneers will cut at first light. His men, meanwhile, translate those sentences down into the muscles of their backs. Unload for a while, rub feeling into fingers, pretend the shiver is volition, at least until the order to move to the bridge makes relief respectable. Bridges attractive, deceiving. A structure 2 miles south promises certainty. Timber cleared approaches, known span measured. But 2 miles under these conditions is not just 2 miles. It is 20, 30, minutes lost to formation shifts, to sled runners, snagging on ruts, to files compressing where the road narrows and discipline strains. The opposing column, not an enemy tonight, so much as a rival for time, makes the same calculation and drifts toward the same magnet. 2 intentions collide quietly. Each chooses dignity over entanglement. The fork unclaimed by doctrine remains claimed by physics, which is a way of saying it remains claimed by the place. Numbers for the body. A man at rest breathes 8, 12 times a minute. Under cold march, it climbs to 20, sometimes more, if anxiety stiffens the diaphragm. Breath is noise. Cloth is technology. A scarf cupped across the mouth catches the hiss, folds it back into the chest. A gloved palm against a wool collar turns a cough into a swallowed drum. Children learn this the first winter they are old enough to understand why grown-ups listen more than they speak. Elders practice it to make dignity look like silence. Runners carry it as method breathing, with wind stepping when needles rustle freezing, when the world goes still. Still is not absence of sound. It is the full attention of the medium. You do not offer yourself to that attention unless you must. Too many men from too many posts learned that in earlier winters, the wrong kind of lesson kept in the bones after leaving the skin. Light. Quarter moon. Clearing between thin scud. Angle low enough to place bars. Across the road bright. Dark. Bright so that a crossing man feels exposed 3 times in 10 paces. Bodies are diaries for such feeling shallow breath. Tightened shoulders. A pause that doctrine calls hesitation and elders call listening. Lanterns reappear, officers need to see the map's edge. Adjutants need to render decisiveness into a small sound, the closing of a book, the scratch of a pencil. Each spark announces itself to tree bark as a pale wash that climbs and fades, climbs and fades. If anything moves in that wash animal branch antler hand, the eye invents a name for it. Naming makes orders easier, but not all names become orders. Some become cautions men choose to honor without confession. Records, yes, there are records. Trader ledgers note the week the fog sat low and renewed itself each hour. A mission diary mentions evening air so still that a whisper carried like a line through timber. A garrison clerk tallies 3 nights of delayed patrols, each report citing conditions. Never fear. And there are family recollections kept without ornament. The river wore a white scarf. The light cut the woods into bars. We followed the left bank where the breath would hide. None of these prove a figure at the tree line. They prove a medium, a regimen, a rhythm. The figure is a mnemonic hung on that rhythm so it can be remembered without a table of numbers. If you prefer to keep the documentary canvas clean, say boundary posture. If your mouth prefers older syllables, say dear man. The physics remains. Consider the senses as instruments calibrated or fooled. Cold, narrow smell heightens hearing. Tricks sight into overvaluing contrast. A man who distrusts his eyes at night will begin to trust his feet. He will feel crust through leather as information, not obstacle. He will learn that a branch's creak is a barometer and that powder falling is permission. He will also learn that ambition has a noise signature too fast, too full, too vertical for low timber, and that the woods can hear it coming. Villagers arrange themselves to be inaudible to that signature, compressing into single file, lowering center of gravity, distributing weight like a careful apology. Armies arrange themselves to be efficient at scale. Efficiency at scale is loud. And finally, maps. A staff map shows a tidy Y at the fork. A contour faint promises a ridge exit. Brush marks for timber are thick where they should be thin where they should be thick. Under a lantern, those marks look persuasive. Under moon, they lie. The true map tonight is made of intervals, gusts that pull fog pauses that drop sift lanes where light stripes threat pockets where sound goes to sleep. Villagers read that map in the body, no ink, no legend, no scale, and convert it into motion. Soldiers carry the paper version and convert it into prudence. Both are rational. One is native to medium, the other is imported. The meeting of the two creates the pause you saw in part 1, the hinge that turned the night. So the ground is firm beneath us, even if it moves. Temperature bends sound. Weight amplifies rhythm. Surface multiplies each mistake. Visibility compresses. Fog writes and unwrites distance. Discipline either harmonizes with those facts or clangs against them. There is no need to conjure terror to explain why 2 roads halted. Numbers and senses perform the explanation together. Like 2 hands on the same drum left, setting the pulse right, shading the tone. In that shared meter, a figure at the tree line half turned. Antlers catching a thin seam of light becomes less an apparition than a signpost. Not here. Not this way. Not now. And while institutions will file conditions, adverse advance deferred the place will keep a simpler entry boundary observed. Passage permitted to those who asked correctly. Ledger balanced by dawn. Wabashkig tests the crust with the heel of his palm. waits for the tiny tremor that tells him the skin of snow will hold for one more careful step. Then lifts his hand and draws a breath as quiet as a thought. The elder behind him mirrors the movement, thumb tucked under wool, staff angled low so wood won't knock wood. 12 bodies drawn into a single narrow line, each foot nested inside the last print, each breath folded into fabric. He counts without numbers, just the old cadence his mother taught him, by the stove when the kettle hissed, hold 2, give 2, glide. The forest listens, as if it were a person, head bent, eyes half shut, deciding whether to permit this small procession. Wabashkig listens back. Listening is what he is good at, better than running, better than speaking. It's why the families asked him to lead tonight, why the elder's daughter pressed a strip of red cloth into his mitten and nodded once as if to tie his courage to his wrist. To the west, faint measured boots on hard road. The rhythm arrives like a memory from a year he would rather not revisit, a drum locked inside leather, a weight that can't be argued with. To the east, another version of the same math, slower by a breath or two, as if the second column were listening to the first and trying not to catch up. Between those two sounds, the woods lay a thin lane of quiet. And that is where Wabashkig holds his body spine aligned with the rib of the slope, shoulders sunk, head slightly turned, so the bright bars of moonlight cannot find the full plane of his face. He raises 2 fingers, lowers them. The line moves. The elder's boot finds the cup he left. The child behind the elder, small fur-edged hood swallowing half his face, places a careful weight as if asking permission of the ground. The boy wants to cough. Wabashkig hears it coiling in the chest like a spring. But a mother's palm pleats the wool over the child's mouth, and the cough turns into a dry click only the nearest bark would notice. Left, Wabashkig breathes not a word. A mouth shape carried by gesture, and the line bends toward the river's shadow, where fog gathers and dissolves in a cycle he knows in his skin. He cannot say how he knows, only that when the tributary exhales a warmer draft, there is a brush on the nose, a whisper against the cheekbones, a slight loosening in the throat. He waits for that brush. It arrives soft, almost imaginary, and he goes. The world shrinks to the width of the path he is inventing, to the circles of breath that expand and vanish just ahead of his face. Somewhere beyond the next fold of timber, someone's steel scabbard touches stone, a ping so clean it feels like a needle against teeth. The elder hears it too. His hand tightens, then loosens, then lifts in a small benediction. No one taught him but winter. The figure at the tree line stands, where bright becomes dark, half-turned antlers lifting a delicate seam of light body, balanced like a human at rest who is not resting. Wabashkig does not look at him long. Looking too long makes a picture heavy, and heavy things leave tracks. He takes the figure as instruction rather than spectacle, a suggestion written in posture. Down low, not up. Curved, never straight. With the grain of shadow not against it. He moves when the needles shiver, halts when they go still, and in one of those halts, he hears the elder whisper the old phrase for asking passage not to a god exactly, and not to a beast, but to a place that can answer. The answer arrives as sift powder loosening from a pine sleeve, dropping in long white commas into the cups of their footprints. Erase, erase, erase. The page edits itself behind them. Wabashkig feels something unclench that he had not noticed clenching. They reach the low shelf above the fork. Fog moves like a slow animal head, down careful attending. Wabashkig tests the edge with the toe of his moccasin and finds the crust thin where a game track crosses. He adjusts 2 hand-widths left, then traces a leaning cedar with his shoulder, so everyone behind will brush the same place and leave no smeared signature for an eager scout. Voices float from the road, men trying to make light of weather men telling jokes the air refuses to carry. A laugh begins, dies, becomes a cough that pretends to be a laugh again. The columns think of the bridge. Wabashkig thinks of the single stone he must find with his foot, where the water runs shallow and silent enough to take them 2 steps without breaking a surface that would sing. Now he says, though it is barely a voice. He goes into the fog and becomes a pair of moving breaths. The elder follows, lifting his hem, so fabric won't drink from the pool at the edge. The child, impossibly obedient, counts the heartbeats between the runner's steps and matches them. Wabashkig places his foot on the stone, feels it slick back, and slides a thin arc, no longer than a handspan, before the toes settle. He leans down and puts fingers in the water to read the current's mood. It is not angry. Not yet. It accepts their weight like a clerk stamping approval. 2 steps, 3, and they find the opposite shelf, darker, quieter, held close by spruce. Behind them, someone on the west road gives an order that isn't one. A sentence made of caution stacked end to end. We'll wait the scud. Take a look by lantern. See if there's a lane. Lantern Wabashkig knows the kind of bubble it makes. He folds the file deeper into the fog to let that bubble flare and fail against its own glare. Small grace, he thinks, not grateful to a man exactly, but to the man's caution, which is respect by another name. The figure at the tree line does not move. His half-turn becomes a measure of time. Wabashkig imagines that if he looked back now, he would only see bars of light and dark exchanging places, no silhouette to hang fear on. He resists the looking. Looking works like hunger, it grows, if fed. A branch, old and patient, decides tonight is the night it returns its weight to the earth. It goes with a sound like a hand clapping slow. Everyone in the line freezes. No one needs to be told. Wabashkig listens for the echo in human body's armor, shifted, breath drawn, quiet broken into smaller pieces, and hears only the river thinking. He realizes with a calm that surprises him that he is not frightened. He is occupied. Fear is for outcomes. He is occupied by sequence. He checks the elder with a glance. The elder's eyes are small fires. The elder nods a nod that says, "Continue what you have been doing. Do not invent new courage for old rules." They climb the rib, a contour. The map will ignore or misdescribe hands against bark feet, turning sideways to keep from puncturing the crust with too much certainty. Wabashkig marks with the back of his knuckles a low bow that could catch a hood. Pasanti, the gesture finds the mother's sleeve. The mother lowers her head without surprise. The child stares at his own breath, then at the place where it merges into fog and disappears. He smiles inside the hood. A private victory, no sound. In the pause before the next movement, the old man speaks one sentence thin as one of the moon's discarded hairs. "Do you see him?" the elder says. Wabashkig answers without turning. "I see where he stood." The elder accepts this as sufficient. Names are useful until they are not. Above them, the sky clears a little moonlight, sharper bars, brighter, and for 20 paces, the world becomes a room with moving walls. The trick is not to fight the geometry. Glide with it. Let the bars pass through you as if you were smoke. Wabashkig shortens his stride, lowers his center, becomes a little less vertical, so his chest will not catch the brightest strip. He feels ridiculous for an instant, then not ridiculous at all, when he notices how the light fails to find a hole of him. Small science, old science. He remembers a story about a man who raised his head too soon and wore a stripe of light like a sash across his coat. He is not in the mood to become a story. They reach the notch that marks the last hard choice up to the ridge path that gives a long view but risks silhouette, or through the low seam that promises cover, but more time. Time is a currency he has been spending against 2 creditors since dusk. He kneels, presses the crust there. Is the tremor there? Is the whisper of powder ready to help? The low seam. He takes it. Down he breathes, and the line folds. The mother's hand has not left the child's shoulder. The elder's staff floats just above the surface, never dragging, never tapping a message to an enemy that does not exist but would welcome a guide. Somewhere closer than comfort cloth scratches against bark. Not their cloth. The sound walks along the trees, stops, walks back. Wabashkig feels a surge of heat that has nothing to do with exertion. The body, faithful and foolish, thinks it can melt danger. He waits for the man to commit 10 paces, 9, 8, and then the air shifts as fog decides to renew. It pours in thin silver, then white, and the scratch loses its address. The man mutters something like "damned low" and returns to the road he understands. Wabashkig squeezes his eyes briefly, less prayer than release, then opens them to the figure he has been ignoring. The antlers drink the last line of light before clouds soften it. Half turn. No threat. Instruction received. They move. They move with a discipline that does not feel like obedience, but like courtesy. Drift shakes loose and slides into their cups. The earth unwrites their argument for existing. In Wabashkig's chest, the tremor he woke with an untidy vibration at the edge of courage has resolved into a steady tone. He thinks of his mother's knuckles knocking the table in patterns, teaching him wind, teaching him when to swallow a cough and when to be allowed to be a child. He thinks of the red strip tucked into his mitten, a little theater of promise, and feels embarrassed by it, then heartened. He will give it back as if he had never needed it. On the slope, the elder falters just once, knee failing to find the exact bowl of print. Wabashkig's hand is there, quick, gentle, no sound. "Easy," he whispers, finally using a word. The elder nods, recovers, continues. The child hears the word and files it under things that are not commands, but still move the world. Above them, a hawk, or something that owns the air at night, cuts a line across the dim and vanishes into a pocket where even the idea of flight seems too loud. The village file becomes a lesson the woods approve of. Minutes lengthen, or shorten, or abandon measurement altogether. They meet a fallen trunk the size of a house and slide under it, not scrambling, not rushing, just committing to the smallness the passage requires. Beyond, the land tips them toward the ridge. Wabashkig tastes iron now, but it is the honest iron of effort, not the metallic anxiety of earlier. He knows absolutely simply that they will reach the spine before the columns choose the bridge, and he knows equally that he does not control either outcome. He is a courier for a place's decision. The humility of it makes him stronger. At the last switchback, the night-open sky, large stars, indifferent the far road. A thread with sparks that pause, hesitate, turn. He sets the line behind a windbreak of young pines and lets them breathe like people, not instruments. The mother laughs once silently, shoulders moving because the child finally coughs the way children must when they are allowed to be honest. The elder sits and seems to become lighter by sitting. Wabashkig walks 3 steps back down the path. Stops at the angle where he knows he could see the tree line if the tree line wished to be seen. And waits. He does not need the figure to appear. He has learned that some presences are not favors to the eye, but habits of a place that the heart can learn to honor without proof. A wind rises, quick, precise, combing the ridge like a careful hand. The forest returns to its baseline needles, ticking trunks, creaking in long, comfortable sentences. From the valley, a late order arrives, too far to parse, easy to understand. Bridges gather men the way answers gather questions. The fork remains itself. The fog writes one last white line and then erases it as if embarrassed by its own calligraphy. Wabashkig opens his mitten and touches the red strip and thinks he might keep it not as a talisman, but as a receipt for a night balance to the penny. He will return it, though. He is tidy in that way. He settles beside the elder. "We're over," he says. The elder smiles without teeth and looks at the child who is asleep, sitting up, breath fogging and disappearing. Fogging. Disappearing. You see, the elder murmurs, not a question. Wabashkig listens to the ridge, then to his own lungs, then to the far faint echoes of decisions made by men who needed daylight to justify them. He answers with a small nod the elder can feel. In the distance, somewhere between joke and order, a captain's voice fails to carry. The night patient exacting closes the hinge that had opened at dusk. Below the place where the figure stood is only bars trading places. Above, the sky learns a paler language at the edges, promising a morning that will pretend the trail never existed. The village believes the pretense, and so survives it. Wabashkig pulls his hood forward and lets his eyes close just for a handful of heartbeats. He sleeps like a runner who has delivered something heavier than a message, and lighter than a myth. He sleeps as if watched, not threatened, watched the way a boundary watches the thing that honored it. When he wakes, the world will be colder, brighter, noisier. For now it is exactly the size of a breath shared by 12 people in a windbreak, and a posture half-turned that never needed a voice to be understood. Out of the hush comes the turn. Not loud, not showy, measured, cumulative, undeniable. This is where contrast sharpens into doctrine, where the outmatched change the variables and the larger machines discover their gears were cut for daylight, not for a night that edits ambition. Begin with the ledger, cold clean, footnoted by wind. Force a 2 columns, 2 roads, has mass drill reach. Force B 1 village file has curvature erasure time. Old approach versus new math. Straight lines versus grain. Presence versus absence. Watch how each exchange tilts the field. Outsmarted. In root logic first. The roads born from surveyor's ink arrive at the fork on perpendiculars, inviting bars of moonlight to count every rib. The village chooses with the grain shadow lanes that run parallel to trunks, low ribs that muffle spread gullies that bend sound downward. In open doctrine, a road accelerates supply and fire. Under canopy, a road accelerates exposure. The village accepts slower ground to make silence their throughput. Slow is invisible, an elder once told a boy. Tonight the sentence becomes a working theory. The columns engineered for certainty must delay to preserve that certainty. The file engineered for uncertainty advances because of it. Outsmarted not by cunning tricks, but by choosing a coordinate system the opponent's map can't plot. Outflanked. In silhouette management, Force A prefers posture upright, rhythmic accessible at a glance. The forest penalizes posture, tall chests slice into bright bars, rifles glint, a man becomes his own lantern. The village shortens its vertical, lowers centers. Angles faces away from glare, half-profile eyes under hoods. Less anatomy, more contour. 1,000 manuals preach minimize target area. Few instruct how to make your shape unreadable to moon and fog. The file practices a folk geometry, never offer a flat plane. Always break the light. To the west and east, officers call that caution. To the low seam along the left bank, it looks like a new kind of rank, the rank of those who will be allowed to pass. Outpaced, in the arithmetic of decision. An army moves on orders. Orders move on justification. Justification needs sight. In fog, sight contracts. And so does authority. The village moves on intervals. Gust cycles sift, drops the audible lull between 2 distant boot cadences. Where Force A inventories minutes, Force B inventories moments. Moments are smaller. Slipperier, but more numerous. Stitched together, they make a corridor no staff clock can schedule. A captain bargains with the dark after the scud. After the lantern check, and while he bargains, 12 bodies cross a river by stepping on a stone that does not appear on any table of bridges. Outpaced not by speed, by sequence. Contrast old tactic versus present landscape. Old tactic probing parties to test timber. Present landscape, a boundary that produces refusal without encounter. Scouts approach the margin, hear the mathematics, the lateral drift of sound, the echo that returns from trunks as if counted by a clerk, and step back. They will write weather. They will write prudence. They will not write that a half-turned posture, antlers briefly edged in gold, removed from them the insult of being ordered to perform bravery that physics would punish. The village writes nothing at all. The wind writes for them, erasures poured steadily into cups of prints. Now, escalate. Stack the contrasts until they topple the assumption that mass always wins. Doctrine concentrate forces at decisive points. Place dissolves point into band fog, thickens, thins, shifts along the fork like a sliding door. Doctrine maintain line integrity. Place breaks line into units of breath. Each man's sound a separate liability unless folded into the rhythm of needles. Doctrine exploit road speed. Place converts speed into volume, volume into signal, signal into danger. The outnumbered learn to be small. The numerous are forced to be still. Stillness wears a uniform poorly, but it suits survival. We return to numbers because numbers discipline the music. Visibility lanes 15 to 30 paces in mixed pine birch under quarter moon, less under scud. Acoustic spread a heel on crust can carry laterally past 50 paces in cold air inversions. Overlapping echoes create false contact points. March rate at night in timber 2 miles per hour, optimistic. 1 1/4 more honest. With pauses every 50 paces, time doubles. Cross load on men 30 to 40 kilograms, amplifying heat signature and silhouette. Fog renewal at confluence periodic tied to temperature differential. Peak density near the meeting seam. Translate these into outcomes. A column that insists on road speed outruns its certainty and must halt. A file that consents to negative space turns the halt into a shield. Outsmarted, outflanked, outpaced the refrain is not contempt. It is measurement. Escalate again into logistics. Bridges are magnets, but magnets tug at both poles. Once one column slides south, the other must either compete for the same crossing or concede the fork. Competing under low visibility risks fratricide and confusion. Conceding preserves strength and dignity at a price measured in schedules. Every mile shifted in winter is not a mile lost, but a window missed. Supply wagons, bunch fires. Concentrate scouts, retask. The village file converts that bunching into a lull behind them, an acoustic pocket where a child may finally cough. A quiet cough payoff paid in coin, no quartermaster counts. Escalation in language. Hear how the reports change tone as caution hardens into policy. Scouts report timber adverse, soft, suggestive. Visibility inadequate for ordered advance, firmer, procedural. Recommend shift to bridge per contingency, decided, respectable. The poetry has been removed, the decision stands bare. Across the valley, oral phrasing goes in the opposite direction, gains metaphor as it records fact. The watch stood is a way to say the conditions articulated themselves. We obeyed. We were permitted. 2 archives will survive, one with tidy sentences, one with antlers catching thin light. Both describe the same pivot. Turn the screw geometry of pursuit. Suppose a scout from the west decides to be bold, 10 paces into timber, then 15. Bright bar across chest. Breath lifts as vapor becomes a flag to his own side. He needs corroboration, another pair of eyes, another 10 paces. But the lane narrows. The echo lies. The fog drifts. Confirmation never arrives. Boldness becomes a report without adjectives. Meanwhile, the village treats pursuit as a math problem. How few edges can we show? How quickly can we erase? At what cadence does the canopy assist? This is not evasion as panic. It is design as humility. Contrast in tools. Lantern versus moon. Lantern publishes, announces itself. humbles the bearer with a ring of blindness. Moon edits admits only what fits the grammar of bars, humbles the onlooker by rationing information. The village elects the editor, not the publisher. A captain who has never liked editors submits to one tonight. He will tell himself he chose this. The place chose it with him. Escalation in bodies. Fatigue, which once made men louder, sloppy feet, fast breath, now makes them careful. Careful becomes contagious. A sergeant who meant to prove something holds his hand at shoulder height, flat slicing the air. Wait. Men adore signals that look like mastery, even when they are simply respect turned into shape. The village sees the same signal and translates it into an open door. The fork remains theirs for another 90 seconds. 90 seconds at a time, you can move a people. 90 seconds at a time, you can keep a forest from being turned into a corridor of orders. The hinge doesn't clang. It clicks. Let's fold in the motif, because motifs are how the mind remembers new rules. Outsmarted route curvature over road confidence. Shadow grain over perpendicular bars. Intervals over minutes. Outflanked profile management over posture. Fog seam over open bend. Erasure over display. Outpaced sequence over speed. Decision cycles over doctrine cycles. Breath over barked cadence. Each over is not moral superiority. It's fitness to medium. War thinks in superiority. Survival thinks in fit. Tonight fit wins. Escalation. Then calm, because calm is the final instrument. The village crests the ridge. The line relaxes into a windbreak. Breaths expand, compress, expand like bellows easing after work. Down in the valley, orders finalize both columns to bridge. The quiet that follows is not defeat. It is a negotiated truce with conditions. The conditions are simple. Do not try to force a place that is set against you. Offer your weight with understanding. Ask properly. The watch half-turned posture at the tree line, antlers briefly bright, was the signature on that contract. You may decline to sign and still obey. Armies do this all the time when they rename respect as prudence. A last contrast, archives versus earth. Paper will preserve delay due to conditions. Snow preserves nothing at all. And in that, nothing is triumph. Where 12 bodies pass the page is blank. Where 2 columns pause the page is also blank, different blank, heavier, with trampled edge, but blank nonetheless. The only durable inscription is in memory. A runner will sleep with his palms open. An elder will sit lighter. A child will be allowed to cough and to laugh at his own steam. Soldiers will remember the feel, not the sight of a lane that refused their mass. Officers will carry a private rule wrong, timber, wrong hour shift to structure. They will teach it to younger men without explaining the night that wrote it. We end this ascent of data with a descent into quiet truths. Not every victory announces itself with a cheer. Not every preservation requires a wall. Some are made of intervals, honored, of angles chosen, of names that make posture memorable. Dear man, so the next child can learn the etiquette, so the next officer can pretend he invented caution, so the forest can remain a place rather than a corridor. The escalation brought us here not to a clash, but to a turn. The road's confidence dissolved. The map bowed. The ledger accepted an entry it did not expect untouched. And so the refrain softens into a benediction you can hear if you lean into the pause between 2 distant boot lines. Outsmarted, outflanked, outpaced. And no one bled for the lesson, because the place taught it in a language that even armies eventually can understand. By dawn, the decision had settled. Not with fanfare, not with flags, just with the quiet weight of men who had finally admitted what the night had already written. Both columns had realized the fork was not theirs, had realized the timber would not be bullied, had realized that prudence was not cowardice but a grammar for staying alive. Orders traveled down the lines like cooled metal measured dull, obedient to the bridge, to structure, to daylight. The road accepted the shuffle of feet turning south. The river held its fog like a modesty garment that would not be lifted. In the space they left behind, the forest inhaled, and then exhaled, and in that breath the verdict stood. Up on the ridge, the village had let their hands loosen, had let shoulders fall from the defensive square, had let the smallest sounds return. A child had coughed without the glove, then had giggled at his own steam, then had slept again, mouth open to the clean cold that does not punish children who are for the moment allowed to be only children. Wabashkig had sat with his back against a young pine, eyes half shut, the tremor gone from his wrists. He had felt not triumph, something steadier. The knowledge that sequence had been exact, that courtesy had been paid, that the night had kept its side of the old agreement. The elder had watched the dawn creep over bark, thin, tentative like a debt being settled with coins that still carry warmth from a palm. We had crossed his bones, said before his mouth found words. They had chosen south, his silence answered. Between those two statements lay the meaning of the watch. Down in the valley, officers parceled out sentences they could defend. The adjutant, who loved decisive taps, had already composed the phrasing. Timber passage impracticable under current visibility. Forces had redeployed to bridge per contingency. He wrote it with a neat hand, added the time, underlined once. Later, when he read his own line aloud, in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and damp wool, no one would raise an eyebrow. The sentence had the right temperature. The West Road captain, whose men trusted him because he never pretended the world could be simpler than it was, had chosen a different cadence. Scouts had advised caution. Echo returns had complicated alignment. A fog seam at confluence had reduced lanes to a hazard. He did not write Dear Man. He did not need to. He had been relieved to have a word like hazard with teeth that bite no one. The payoff did not gather men into a cheering frame. It unfurled in the ledgers, the subtle multiplying kind of change that campaigns feel days later when plans meant to dovetail by noon arrive at the edge of the table and discover the edge has moved. A regiment's timetable had been pushed. A supply wagon's crossing had been delayed, stacking rations into an hour the cooks did not expect. A patrol's reconnaissance arc had been shortened, creating a blind pocket on a map a clerk would later annotate with a modest question mark. None of these by themselves looked like story. Together, they were a turn. The rivers in winter have always been adept at such downstream arithmetic. The forest had merely joined the calculation. Listen to the past perfect settle its calm authority, its acknowledgement that realization tends to arrive after the act. The columns had thought speed would carry the argument. The night had reset the clock. The officers had assumed geometry would behave. The canopy had refused perpendiculars. The scouts had believed boldness might purchase clarity. The fog had counteroffered with a contract written in smaller print. The village had trusted memory over paper. The place had signed with them. And the antlers, yes, the posture at the tree line, had turned the hinge. He had not spoken, had not threatened, had not promised. He had only been where the bars of moonlight demanded a witness. And in that witness men had felt the weight of their own outlines and had reconsidered. Payoff is sometimes nothing more than men remembering they are visible. Aftermath carries many voices, each quieter than the last. On the ridge, Wabashkig had loosened the red strip from his mitten and smoothed it, embarrassed by its sentiment, grateful for its work. He had considered keeping it, then had folded it as one folds a letter that has been answered and had tucked it where it would not show. The elder had lifted his staff and found it suddenly light, as if wood itself had celebrated their passage by agreeing to be less wood for a time. The mother had braided a strand of hair that had escaped the hood, small practical arranging the future on a scalp that had survived the night. These are not fireworks. They are terms of peace renewed in the bodies that must carry them. On the eastern road, a lieutenant had closed his map, then had opened it again. then had closed it once more as if the gesture could erase the taste of hesitation. He would later tell a story pared down, reasonable about fog and scud and timber density. He would omit the moment when light had briefly laced those antlers, and his chest had told him in old syllables that the step his boot wanted to take would become a bright sash across bone. He would not call that fear. He would call it respect, because he was older by noon than he had been at midnight. On the western road, a corporal who bragged because bragging holds heat had walked a few paces apart and had stared at the line of trees as if waiting for them to decide the matter again. He had realized with a private shock that the trees did not care for his bravado, and that his bravado did not care for his men. He had been grateful that the order to shift south had arrived before he had to choose between the two. Later hours into the day, when coffee burns tongues and reports clean themselves, the columns would look like columns again. Men would joke in ways that recovered distance from the thing they had obeyed. Someone would name the fog old lace, and someone else would repeat the phrase in the tone that turns a minor inconvenience into an enemy they have already beaten. Yet traces would linger. A sergeant who had once marched his squad with chin-high certainty would at the next timber margin hold his palm a fraction longer in the air, flat quiet wait. An adjutant whose sentences had always known their destination would at the next fork find himself writing perhaps, then would scratch it out, then would write recommend, then would undercut recommend with under present conditions. Respect is clumsy when freshly learned, for the village aftermath meant more than reprieve. It meant the continuity of instruction. Children would hear the story in a register calibrated to their sleep, not of arrows and alarms, but of a left bank that had welcomed their weight, of a fog that had adopted their outlines, of a ridge that had let them rest without erasing the thread they had followed. When someone asked about Deer Man, because someone always does, the elder would narrow his eyes, not to be mysterious, but to give the mouth time to choose a gentle word. We had walked under a watch, he would say. The watch had stood. Wabashkig would add nothing. His silence would be the exact size of the bars of light he had refused. In the stove's glow, a child would lift his hands as if they were antlers, then would laugh at himself, then would draw them down to his sides, when his mother's look reminded him that joking and reverence share a wall. Payoff also writes itself into doctrine quietly, where men with neat hands keep shelves. The phrase "do not enter blind timber" under low moon had existed in manuals for years, but now it would be cited with more fervor, as if some private testimony had volunteered for the footnote. Reconnaissance justifications would shift from bold to bounded. The contagious courage that had once praised the first man through the lanes would begin to praise the first man who said "not this way, not now," and said it early enough to save everyone from pretending later that the decision had been science all along. The bridge overused for a week because caution had become fashion would groan under the number of boots and wheels sent to prove that prudence could be busy too. No one would sign a memo with antlers. The memo would nevertheless carry their silhouette. If you need a louder shape because stories sometimes do imagine the consequences as ripples, the fork left unclaimed becomes a rumor that soldiers repeat in tones that protect their pride. It was bad timing. It was a low bank. It was a poor lane. That rumor meets a scheduler's pencil, and the pencil adjusts a column's arrival by half a day. Half a day collides with a separate convoy already promised the same stretch of road. Congestion breeds delay. Delay forces quartermasters to reassign sacks. The noise of all this arithmetic fills the air like a late storm men were told had already passed. From the ridge, the village watches none of that. They are choosing the next shadow, the next safe stove, the next morning that will let them say, "We were permitted." Had there been a confrontation, we would count casualties. We would tally metal and flesh. We would map the arc of ruin with arrows that make sense only after the blood dries. The luxury, yes, the luxury of this payoff is that we count quiet instead. We count minutes in which men had thought themselves instruments of will, and became for a useful hour instruments of place. We count a forest kept whole, not forever, not by decree, but held intact for a night by a discipline that invited its own continuance. We count the absence of a sound, the shot that had not been fired, the shout that had not been necessary, and we say, the ledger is honest. Before noon, the sky had brightened into a pale sheet clouds, whitening the world into a simple page. Tracks at the fork had blurred, then had gone. The broad churns near the road, evidence of hesitation, had dried into nothing a stranger would take for ordinary wear. The figure at the tree line, if he had been there at all, had become a room made of bars, trading places, a posture distributed into trunks and air. But the memory held, not because men cultivated it like a shrine, but because bodies teach longer than minds. A lieutenant's hand would rise at the next margin without consulting him. A runner's feet would find the exact cadence of sift without explanation. The watch had stood. The watch would stand again. Because the medium keeps its habits, and the people who learn them become themselves a medium. The aftermath closes without closing, as the best ones do. No bells, no carved stone, only a place that had asserted a boundary without venom, and people on both sides who had learned briefly to take yes for an answer when yes meant not here, not now. If you need a last image, take this Wabashkig eyes finally clear of sleep, offering the red strip back to the elder's daughter. Her hand hovering a second, then closing. The fabric a bridge between risks taken and rest earned. In the far distance, a bugle tries a note, abandons it, waits for orders that have already been written by weather. The day moves on, busy, careless, inevitable. But in the woods, a thin courtesy remains, like a fine line of gold on antlers just before the cloud returns, just before the lesson folds itself away, ready quietly to be taught again. Dawn thins to a quiet ribbon across the ridge, the kind of light that doesn't announce itself so much as arrive, modest, careful, unsure if it is wanted. The frost loosens just a little where breath has layered it through the night. Needles release last whispers of sift. The valley becomes legible in the plain language of day. And yet, something of the night holds. Not the drama, no trumpets, no lines meeting lines, just the shape of a boundary that declined to be crossed. You can't point to it at noon, you can't circle it in ink. But it lives in bodies, how shoulders settle before a margin, how feet shorten their reach at a tree line, how silence keeps a small authority even when orders return. The watch is gone, or rather, redistributed bars trading places between bright and shade. An after-image the eye stops chasing, because the heart has already learned the lesson. The forest which needed no witness keeps none. We keep it for it in the way we move. Consider what was spared, not as a ledger of enemies refused, but as a room left intact. The path beneath the pines does not carry the day's new sorrow. The river's lip does not memorize a struggle in its ice. A ridge wine does not learn to carry the names of the fallen. It carries only needles and the thin smoke of stoves and the small laughter of a child allowed to cough at last. War will write itself elsewhere loudly, with all the certainty of men who confuse noise for narrative. Here the pen lifted. Here the sentence broke into white space and refused to resume. The refusal wasn't moral theater. It was fit between place and people and the discipline of listening. Later, when someone asks why the fork was never taken, they will be handed phrases: visibility inadequate, passage impracticable, structure preferred, and the phrases will do because paper must eat words. But the truth tasted like frost and sounded like restraint. Look again slowly at the parts that made the whole. A runner who counted the world in intervals, an elder who knew the value of a breath saved, a mother who folded a cough into wool and bought silence with gentleness, A child who learned that fear can be kept small without being denied. On the roads, officers who were faithful to their men by being faithful to the physics. Scouts who turned back without shame because a bar of light wrote caution across bone. Columns that accepted South not as defeat, but as a way of not lying to themselves. No song will be made of them, not the kind with drums and shouted names. But if the country has any memory worth keeping, it lives where men and women agree to be smaller than the places they pass through. Smallness, so often mistaken for surrender, is just another word for measure. We imagine legends as loud things, crowds of syllables, teeth in the dark banners torn by a wind that knows the script. But the dear man, if the mouth insists on a name, kept to a different register. He didn't frighten, he didn't plead. He held posture, half-turned antlers, catching what little gold the moon allowed, returning it to eyes that needed an excuse to do what their bodies already knew. You can strip his antlers from the story if you prefer. You can call him boundary posture or a mnemonic for a night's discipline, and you won't be wrong. The point is not the antlers. The point is that men can be persuaded by an outline to respect what they had intended to argue with. We keep outlines because they help us remember how to behave when memory goes thin. If there is an ethic to draw, and documentaries are greedy for ethics, it's not the brittle kind that breaks when shouted at. It's closer to craft. Move with the grain, not against it. Offer less surface to the bars of light. Slide where fog wants you. Let wind write your edits. Measure your breath against the needle's small music. These are not rules for war. They are rules for not letting war do all the writing. A campaign can claim miles. A people can claim manners. Manners, in the forest's language, are physics made kind. The day will mislead you. Under this smoother light, the fork looks trivial. Two modest waters joining hands, a bend so polite it could be sketched by a child. The timber seems friendly bark, warm to the palm resin awake. You might be tempted to unlearn the night's grammar and call it superstition. Resist that temptation. Daylight forgives many errors so it can reveal others. Night forgives almost none. What held last night is still here, only dormant. The bars of moon will return, the fog seam will renew, the sound will lie again wonderfully instructively. Men will take comfort in the bridge for a week, then grumble at the bottleneck their wisdom created, then forget the bottleneck's cause. The forest won't argue. It has patience, which is a power that never needs to say its name. If you are asking quietly, honestly, what the story asks of you, it isn't worship. And it isn't cynicism. It is a practice. Before entering, ask whether you are too vertical for the light that's waiting. Before speaking, listen for the small shift in air that means the place, not you, intends to talk. Before naming, accept that names may arrive late, useful, mnemonic, imperfect, and that the conduct should precede the vocabulary. If you must carry a figure with you for the sake of remembering, carry the half-turn, the way a body can insist without force, the way antlers call them instruments of light, briefly stitched a seam between caution and passage. But leave room always for the simpler sentence, the forest kept itself. Aftermath properly told does not cut to victory parades or to the ledger of blame. It lingers in ordinary rooms. A stove wakes and shares its thin halo. Cloth dries never quite fully on a line stretched from beam to beam. Someone retells the route with fewer gestures than the night seemed to require. Someone says the word watch and lets it mean both the thing worn at the wrist and the attention kept at the margin. A boy imitates a runner's careful stance and is corrected, not scolded, just adjusted so that the imitation becomes practice. An elder closes his eyes and becomes a small archive, one that will never fit on a shelf, one that needs fire and breath and patient listeners to stay viable. If history is to be of any use, it must learn to love such rooms as much as it loves maps. You may notice on some later walk, unrelated to war, that your feet shorten at the edge of a grove. that your eyes look for the darker grain, that your breath waits for the tiny rain of powder before committing weight. Nothing requires you to thank the watch for this. Nothing asks you to dramatize it in front of anyone. It is enough that the body remembers. Enough that you, a person among persons, move as if place were a partner rather than a stage. Enough that the next child finds a forest still capable of saying no, and a community still capable of hearing yes in that no, when the yes means not here, not now. What if this is the question that ends wars badly and also prevents a few from beginning? What if the columns had insisted? What if pride had mistaken prudence for shame and pressed men into bars of light to save a timetable? The answer, if we are honest, is the same answer. History offers too often the page would have filled, with lines of noise and lines of grief, with arrows that look decisive long after their tips have cooled. We will not write that page today. We are permitted for once to let a blank stand where ink usually rushes in. Blankness is not absence, it is protection. It is the forest's signature on a night it authored with simple tools. We turn gently towards water. A mist that edited a plan at the fork will thicken downstream into a doctrine of its own. Where currents meet, where temperature shifts by a degree or two, where the surface looks like glass and behaves like memory, decisions will tilt again. Men who believe they can see will discover that seeing is the least of it. Fog will tutor them in the humility of nearness, how close you must be to tell friend from reflection, how quiet you must become to hear your own boat. We will go there next not to contradict the forest, but to extend its grammar. Different medium, same etiquette. Another place that can push back without raising its voice. Until then, hold the night's cadence a little longer. Step where a kinder world would want your foot. Carry your heat as if it belonged to more than you. Leave fewer seams in the snow. If you pass a stand of pine under a thin moon and feel only for a breath, the old measure return, do not hurry it away. Let it count you not to subtract you, but to remind you that being counted is not the same as being claimed. The watch is nobody's property. It stands for the forest. It stands for those who pass through with care. It stands for the margin where ambition learns to bow and does not feel humiliated by the gesture. We close softly without sealing. The ridge keeps its wind. The river keeps its breath. The page keeps its white space where a story might have shouted, and by not shouting, became worth keeping. Somewhere a runner wakes and feels in the wrists the steady echo of a night balanced to the penny. Somewhere an officer shapes a sentence that will help his men live. Somewhere a child tries on antlers, made of fingers smiles, remembers to lower them. And somewhere always bars of light trade places with bars of shade, and a posture half turned declines to be seen because the seeing isn't the point. The point is that the woods remained themselves, and that we, for a necessary hour, did too.